The mud of the Yazoo Delta was not just earth, it was a hungry, sucking beast, perpetually warm, smelling of rot and sweet decay. It was the color of old blood and despair, and in the year 1850, it became the resting place for 28 souls who had hunted the wrong man. 28 men, tough, cruel, self-proclaimed masters of the land, swallowed whole by the same water they believed they owned. They vanished, not to disease, not to battle, but to the deliberate, calculated rage of a single escaped human being. This was not rumor whispered around a dying campfire. This was history etched into the terrified silence of the Mississippi night, a silence that followed the horrific churning of the river. 28. That number became a poison in the mouth of every plantation owner from Vicksburg to Natchez. It represented an unthinkable casualty rate, an offense against the very order of their world. But more terrifying than the number itself was the source, a specter the remaining hunters soon dubbed the Delta Phantom. His name, before it became a legend, was Caleb. He was a piece of property deemed strong, stubborn, and now fatally clever. He had escaped the clutches of the sprawling hawthorn plantation just weeks prior, carrying nothing but a deep knowledge of the swamps and an even deeper, burning grievance that required far more than simple freedom to satisfy. The Mississippi Delta in 1850 was a place defined by cotton, heat, and the unrelenting, suffocating presence of violence. It was a geography built upon suffering, where fortunes were made on the backs of stolen labor, and the air itself felt heavy with injustice. The vast plantations stretched endlessly, interrupted only by the chaotic, untamed arteries of the rivers, the Big Black, the Yazoo, and countless nameless winding bayous, all feeding the colossal Mississippi. The law was arbitrary, and the ultimate authority rested not with dusty statutes, but with the whip and the gun. And protecting this brutal status quo were the slave catchers, often called paddy rollers, men who specialized in tracking, recapturing, and delivering punishment far worse than death. They were the scavengers of the system, motivated by bounty and sadism. Yet this land, which seemed so thoroughly controlled by human cruelty, held its own wild, unpredictable spirit. The swamp was an anarchist, an ally to those who knew its secrets. It was a labyrinth of cypress knees and stagnant pools, teeming with cottonmouths, alligators, and fever-bearing mosquitoes. For the enslaved, it was the only direction freedom lay. For the hunters, it was a necessary evil, a landscape to be conquered through sheer, stubborn force. Sheriff Gideon Thorne, a man whose mustache drooped like a weeping willow and whose eyes held the cold emptiness of a long winter, was tasked with retrieving Caleb. Thorne had seen men escape before. He had tracked them through mountains, across fields, and run them down with hounds until their feet bled trails on the earth. But this was different. Caleb was not just running, he was dissolving into the landscape, and worse, he was fighting back with a meticulous, deadly strategy. The initial reports were confusing, almost laughable, until the scale of the disaster became undeniable. 3 catchers tracking Caleb near the Yazoo River basin vanished. Their horses were found tethered, their boots resting dry on the bank, but the men were gone, leaving no struggle, no blood, only the gentle ripple of disturbed water. Thorne dismissed it as the river claiming them, a common, if frustrating, occurrence. Then came the second group, 6 men, led by a renowned tracker named Silas. They found signs of Caleb, a perfectly preserved footprint, a snapped twig, only to find themselves hopelessly lost in a circular trap of swamp grass and false trails. They wandered for 3 days, subsisting on stagnant water, before Silas, driven mad by the heat and the mosquitoes, tried to shoot his own horse and was accidentally shot by one of his own men. The remaining 5 stumbled back to civilization, broken and babbling about a man who could walk on water, a ghost who spoke through the cicadas. The conflict was thus established. It was not a chase. It was a psychological siege. Caleb was using the environment, that fierce delta heat and deceptive geography, as his main weapon. He did not need to fight fair in the light. He controlled the darkness and the depth. Why was Caleb running now? What made him transition from enduring the unimaginable to risking the absolute? Open loops existed in the few pieces of information Thorn had managed to extract from the Hawthorne overseer. Caleb had been a carpenter, a powerfully built man, known for a quiet, contained demeanor. But weeks before his escape, his wife Ilara was sold south, ripped from the plantation in the middle of the night. Her departure, an act of sheer economic cruelty by the master, was the fracture point. It had broken Caleb's quiet endurance. He ran, not just for freedom, but driven by a vengeance so profound it sought not just to escape the chain, but to shatter the entire system that forged it. And his chosen path of escape, the water, was a chilling counterpoint to the dry, dusty cruelty of the cotton fields. He seemed to have an affinity, a dangerous intuition for the river's rhythm. Thorn, recognizing that 9 men had already been nullified by one runaway, assembled an unprecedented force. He brought in not just local paddy rollers, but professional bounty hunters from Tennessee and Alabama, men hardened by years of tracking Seminole in the swamps of Florida. The final posse numbered 35, including Thorn himself. They were armed with repeating rifles, shotguns, and the best tracking hounds money could buy. Their mission was clear: bring Caleb back alive for maximum punishment, or bring back his body to serve as a terrorizing example. The development of the hunt was a descent into shared madness. The dogs were useless. The scent trails led nowhere, or worse, led them into thickets of razor grass, or into quicksand-like mud pits, where men had to drag each other out, sweating profusely, covered in leeches. The sun beat down with a malicious intensity that turned the air into thick soup. The men were not fighting Caleb. They were fighting the heat, the thirst, the gnats that swarmed their eyes, and the incessant, deafening drone of the delta. Caleb's presence was only ever felt indirectly. Supplies would go missing, just a little at a time. A coil of rope, a bag of dried beans, a small tin of gunpowder. The men would blame each other, their tempers fraying. One night, a hunter named Jeb swore he heard a deep, humming chant coming from the darkest depths of the cypress swamp, a sound that seemed to mimic the moan of the wind through the tall pines. Jeb claimed it was the devil calling them by name. He deserted the next morning, leaving his rifle behind. This escalating psychological terror was Caleb's masterful pattern interrupt. The hunters expected a desperate, starving man hiding under a log, easy prey for 35 well-fed, well-armed professionals. They found instead an invisible intelligence that systematically dismantled their sense of security. The hunters, who were the apex predators of this society, found themselves preyed upon by the swamp itself, guided by the unseen hand of the phantom. The posse began to move with desperate caution, their formation tight, their eyes darting nervously. They stopped trusting the paths, the dogs, and finally, each other. This led to a grim discovery. 3 more men, part of the advanced scouting party, were found dead, meticulously arranged beneath a curtain of Spanish moss. They weren't drowned, they weren't shot. They had died from venomous snake bites, dozens of them. But the snakes were dead too, their heads bashed in, and the bodies of the victims were surrounded by perfect, unnaturally straight circles drawn in the mud. It was clearly staged, a morbid tableau designed to break the morale of the pursuers. This was the re-engagement, the point where the fear became absolute and systemic. Thorn gathered the remaining 23 men. He looked at their drawn, feverish faces, their sweat-soaked clothes hanging off gaunt frames, and knew he had lost control of the narrative. "He is just a man," Thorn bellowed, his voice raw. "He bleeds, he starves. We are done with this swamp madness. We find the water and we flush him out." Thorn realized that Caleb, the Delta Phantom, had been deliberately leading them. Every misplaced trail, every dead snake, every vanishing supply was a breadcrumb leading them to one specific location. The unstable, treacherous confluence where the Yazoo and the Sunflower Rivers merged. This area was locally known as the Whispering Flats, a zone of constantly shifting sandbars and unpredictable, powerful undercurrents. It was especially dangerous when the summer storms began to blow in from the Gulf. Tracking Caleb finally paid off late on that fateful evening in August 1850. The posse burst through a final curtain of swamp reeds and found themselves standing on a low, muddy peninsula jutting into the swirling brown water. On the opposite bank, lit by the ominous glow of a sudden, bruising sunset, was Caleb. He stood tall, soaked to the bone, his clothes ragged, but his posture was not one of surrender. He was waiting. Thorne raised his rifle, sighting the runaway. This was it. The hunt was over. All the deaths, the madness, the terror, it culminated in this moment of inevitable capture. "Caleb!" Thorne's voice cracked across the water. "The game is done! Drop to your knees!" Caleb did not move. He simply lifted one hand, pointing slowly and deliberately, not at the sheriff, but toward the sky, which was now turning a sickly, sulphurous yellow. A low, guttural rumble of thunder began to vibrate through the earth, a sound far deeper and louder than any gunshot. Then the true nature of the trap was revealed, the environmental climax that Caleb had engineered over weeks. The Whisper Flats were designed to flood violently, instantly, with only a slight rise in the rivers, especially when combined with a downpour. Caleb had spent days on that far bank, subtly undermining the soft mud and clearing the debris that naturally slowed the current. He wasn't trapped, the hunters were. As the first massive drops of rain began to fall, fat and heavy, turning the mud beneath the catcher's feet slick and treacherous, Caleb lowered his hand. He looked across the churning water at the 35 men who represented the cruelty of their entire world, and then he turned and walked, calmly and intentionally, into the rapidly swelling river. The posse, driven by rage and the promise of bounty, did not hesitate. "After him!" Thorne shrieked. "Into the water!" they charged. 35 men, rifles held high, plunging into the dark, swirling current, desperate to reach the man who had tormented them. But the water was already rising, and the storm had broken with the fury of an unleashed deity. The confluence was no longer a river. It was a murderous vortex, aided by the subtle, deadly engineering of the Delta Phantom. They went in 35 strong. The river accepted the first 7 quickly, pulling them down into the soft, yielding bottom. The others, momentarily stunned by the immediate, overwhelming power of the current, realized they were caught in a hydro death trap. The swirling brown waters churned, sucking at legs, dragging men toward the deeper channel. The screams began, high and piercing, drowned almost instantly by the torrential downpour and the ceaseless roar of the storm. We must look closer at this terrible, swift carnage. We must understand how a single man used the geography of oppression to claim his revenge, transforming the swamp from a prison into a weapon. We must count the bodies that night and understand how the legend of the Delta Phantom was sealed in the suffocating waters of Mississippi. Join us in Part 2, where we detail the systematic drowning of the 28 catchers and the enduring mystery of Caleb's final fate in the tempestuous night of 1850. The humid air of the Mississippi Delta did not simply carry sound. It swallowed it, muffling the heavy breathing of the 28 slave catchers until their presence felt less like a coordinated manhunt and more like a collection of desperate whispers lost among the cypress knees. They were deep within the swampland now, past the point of easy retreat, where the ground shifted underfoot with the sickening sound of sucking mud, a geological trap waiting to spring. Captain Elias Vance, the hardened leader of this mercenary company, tasted the metallic fear mixing with the sweat on his lip. He was a man built on success, renowned from Natchez to Baton Rouge for his brutal efficiency in retrieving property. His chest, usually puffed with the certainty of command, felt tight, constrained not by the thick cotton of his shirt, but by the invisible, palpable antagonism of the environment itself. Vance had hunted runaways before, hundreds of them, but this was different. This pursuit felt less like a tracking exercise and more like walking willingly into the belly of an unfed beast. The fugitive, known only by the growing moniker of the Delta Phantom, had left a trail that was meticulously designed not to be followed, but to be misinterpreted. Every snapped branch, every disturbed pile of leaves suggested speed and panic, the hallmarks of a terrified escapee. But the trail was too clean. It led them exactly where the fugitive wanted them, deeper into the maze of treacherous, interconnected bayous and backwaters that defined the forgotten corners of the great river's mouth. Vance remembered the bounty, the obscene sum of money offered by the planter, Mr. Alistair, for the safe return, or even just the assured demise of this particular man. The fugitive was not just a laborer. He was rumored to be educated, skilled, and worst of all, an inspiration to others. His successful escape, now spanning 3 weeks of impossible evasion, had already cost the planter thousands in ruined crops and supervisory wages. The 28 men chasing him were not simply fulfilling a contract. They were chasing a fortune, a guarantee of comfort that they rarely achieved through honest work in that brutal, unforgiving era between 1750 and 1850. The darkness intensified quickly, not the gentle fade of evening, but a sudden opaque shroud cast by the impossibly dense canopy above. The air grew thick with the smell of stagnant water, musk, and the sweet rot of decaying vegetation. The sounds of the swamp, the chirps, the croaks, the distant unsettling splash of something large moving unseen began to press in on the periphery of their awareness, transforming the familiar night into something menacing and personalized. It was in this suffocating darkness that the first pattern interrupt occurred. They were crossing a particularly slick stretch of ground, balancing on slippery, moss-covered logs that had been strategically laid across a deep channel. The logs were meant to facilitate their passage, but one of the catchers, a hulking brute named Silas, lagged behind, muttering about a blister. He swore under his breath, adjusting the heavy flintlock musket he carried, a cumbersome relic of war. Vance heard the splash. It wasn't the panicked, flailing splash of someone falling into shallow water. It was a deep, guttural plunge, immediately followed by silence. No cry for help, no thrashing, nothing but the immediate return of the Delta's oppressive quiet. Vance stopped the column with a sharp, upward hand gesture. "Silas, you clumsy ox, where are you?" Only the whispering chorus of crickets answered. 2 men turned back, holding up oil lamps that cast ridiculously small circles of light against the wall of the night. They found the heavy musket lying on the bank, the stock slightly buried in the mud. Silas, a man weighing near 250 pounds, was gone. There were no tracks leading away, only a disturbed patch of water near the log, already calming itself, leaving no trace of violence, only absence. Vance's face hardened. He dismissed it instantly, publicly. "Fool likely tripped and sank in that deep muck. Didn't follow instructions, keep moving." But the dismissal was brittle. He knew the depths of the Delta. It didn't just drown a man, it consumed him completely, silently. This was not the work of an accidental slip. This was the first stroke of a deliberate hand. The knowledge spread like a contagion through the remaining 27 men. They were no longer hunters. They were now prey moving through the territory of a predator who understood the landscape as intimately as they understood their own palms. The fugitive had not run far. He had simply melted into the surrounding ecology, adopting the methods of survival taught not just by necessity, but by generations of enforced resilience and secret knowledge. He knew the hidden pathways, the trembling earth areas, patches of seemingly solid ground, which were, in reality, thin mats of root systems floating atop deep, cold water. He knew where the old river boundaries lay, where defunct levees created subtle yet catastrophic traps. The subsequent hours were a slow, agonizing descent into paranoia. Every shadow moved. Every rustle of leaves sounded like a knife being drawn. The fugitive never showed himself, but his presence was undeniable. Their small skiffs, essential for navigating the deepest waters, had been painstakingly hauled overland at great effort. When they finally reached the next navigable stream, intending to put their exhausted horses and themselves onto the flat-bottomed boats, they found only ruin. Ropes were neatly severed, not gnawed or broken, but cut with precision. The boats themselves had been dragged into a narrow, choked channel and subtly punctured, not sunk immediately, but left with slow, insidious leaks designed to take effect hours later when they were miles from solid land. This realization brought Captain Vance to a near frenzy. His reputation was built on control, and now not only was the fugitive loose, but their means of reliable transport and immediate escape was compromised. They were cut off. They were isolated. Vance rallied his men, resorting to the familiar rhetoric of promised wealth and racial superiority. "He is only one black dog, a runaway animal. He is terrified and cornered. We have guns, we have numbers, we press on. The deeper we go, the closer we are to closing the noose." His speech, however, fell flat. The 27 men looked less like an organized force and more like desperate, sweating figures whose eyes continually darted towards the surrounding darkness. They had seen what the Delta did to Silas. They understood now that their weapons were useless against water and mud, and their numbers were simply more mouths for the swamp to feed. The fugitive continued to manipulate the path ahead. He did not need to fight them hand to hand yet. He used misdirection. He placed a discarded piece of fabric, stained faintly with blood, a piece of his own shirt, cut days prior, near a small, dry knoll. This drew Vance's attention immediately. "He's wounded, see? We have him bleeding," Vance shouted, momentarily forgetting the vanishing of Silas and the ruined boats. He focused solely on the perceived victory. He ordered the men to converge rapidly on the knoll. This was the critical command, the moment of self-immolation. The knoll looked like a small island of safety, a dense clump of older trees rising a few feet above the pervasive floodline. It was the only place in sight where 27 men could stand without immediately sinking past their ankles. They moved toward it rapidly, driven by the renewed promise of a quick end and the massive reward. But the fugitive, the Delta Phantom, knew the history of that land. That knoll was not ancient solid earth. It was the site of a long-abandoned, poorly constructed dyke built by earlier generations of slaves forced to tame the unpredictable river. It was earth-packed poorly over a centuries-old tributary that occasionally still surged. Crucially, the fugitive had spent the previous 2 days in meticulous, exhausting labor, unnoticed by the distant pursuers. Using only crude tools and his own immense strength, he had slowly, methodically undermined the backside of that earthen mound where the pressure of the bayou water was greatest. He hadn't opened the dam yet. He had simply weakened its structural integrity until the heavy burden of 27 men, all standing shoulder to shoulder, carrying heavy weapons and supplies, would be the final, fatal pressure required. As Vance and his company stepped onto the seemingly safe ground, they felt an unsettling sponginess beneath their boots. The soil gave way slightly, making a squishing sound, but they were too relieved to be out of the ankle-deep muck to notice the danger. They gathered, panting, their figures illuminated sporadically by the now flickering lanterns. Vance stood triumphantly at the highest point, pointing his cutlass toward the darkness beyond the knoll. "He's out there, cornered. We split into 3 teams. We will flush him out before dawn." He felt the ground shift, a deep, stomach-churning vibration that was unlike anything caused by simple mud. It was the movement of mass against volume. The 27 men paused, looking at each other. They heard the sound, a low, grinding rumble, the sound of earth failing under strain. A deep, cold draft rose from beneath the knoll, carrying the smell of ancient silt and fast-moving water. One of the younger catchers screamed, a thin, high sound of pure terror, pointing down at his feet. Cracks, thin and sinister, spiderwebbed across the packed earth. Captain Vance looked down, his arrogance finally draining away, replaced by the sickening realization that he had not cornered the prey. He had led his entire company directly into the jaws of the earth itself. The fugitive had not just run, he had engineered a disaster, weaponizing the very geography of the Mississippi Delta against the men who sought to enslave him. The rumbling intensified, sounding now like distant thunder trapped beneath the soil. The center of the knoll began to visibly sink, water weeping up through the cracks, cold and aggressive. The weight of the men, the pressure of their collective bodies and equipment, was achieving the fugitive's terrible purpose. Vance tried to give a command, but the words caught in his throat. He saw the water bubbling furiously now, realizing this was not quicksand, but a deliberate, massive, structural failure. He was standing on a bomb made of earth and water. The men, recognizing the imminent catastrophe, started to panic, scrambling towards the edge of the knoll, only to find the surrounding waters too deep to cross safely, and the path they had used to enter already dissolving behind them. They were trapped on a disintegrating island, a congregation of doomed men awaiting the final vengeance of the Delta Phantom, who watched, silent and invisible, from the cover of the dense palmettos, waiting for the earth to complete the terrible deed he had so meticulously planned. The grand, horrific consequence of their arrogance, the swift, absolute drowning of the 28 men, including the fate of Captain Vance, was now measured only in the space of a few terrifying breaths, the terrifying pause before the engineered land gave way entirely, fulfilling the most brutal and legendary revenge story of the 1850 Mississippi swamplands. The stage was set for the dark waters to claim their unprecedented bounty, proving once and for all that sometimes the oppressed master the environment far better than the oppressors could ever master a man. This narrative is leading directly to the climax in Part 3, having established the complete psychological breakdown and physical entrapment of the slave catchers, setting the stage for the mass drowning event. The air hung thick and sour, tasting of silt and ancient decay, a blanket pressed down upon the water that mirrored the absolute black of the sky above. Captain Silas Thorne, though his clothes were heavy with swamp moisture and his face drawn taut with days of fruitless pursuit, felt a surge of cold, focused determination. They had him. 28 men, packed onto 7 flat-bottomed skiffs, rifles at the ready, positioned in the narrow, winding throat of the bayou, a choke point that Elias, the Delta Phantom, could not possibly evade. This was the trap's mouth, and they were the teeth. Thorne raised his hand, signaling the men to halt their clumsy paddling. The only sounds now were the buzzing clouds of mosquitoes, the occasional unsettling plop of something large disappearing beneath the surface, and the nervous, shallow breathing of the catchers. Fear was a palpable thing, shared equally among them, not of the escaped man himself, but of the place he inhabited. The swamp was too vast, too silent, too full of things that watched and waited. Then the water itself began to speak, not the ripple of a disturbed fish, but a deep, churning thrum coming from upriver, beyond the curve of the bayou, where the main channel of the Mississippi was supposed to be a safe distance away. It was a sound that knowledgeable rivermen instantly recognized, the shifting, restless violence of massive amounts of water suddenly moving where they ought not. "What in God's name is that?" whispered one of the younger catchers, his voice cracking, raising his rifle in confusion rather than aim. Thorne dismissed it with a shake of his head, believing it to be a localized eddy, or perhaps a log rolling off the bank. "Stay focused. He's here. I can smell him," he hissed. But the thrumming escalated swiftly, growing into a guttural roar, like an enormous beast finally waking from sleep. The surface of the bayou, previously still and slick, began to tremble violently. Small waves, tight and fast, began slapping the sides of the skiffs, pushing them dangerously close to the dense, root-tangled banks. And then Elias appeared. He did not swim to them, nor did he sneak through the reeds. He stood, 50 yards ahead, where the water should have been deep enough to cover a man entirely. Elias rose slowly, the black river water streaming off his powerful shoulders. He was impossibly tall against the dark cypress trunks, a silhouette carved out of pure shadow and fear. He wore nothing but tattered linen binding his waist, and in the faint moonlight filtering through the canopy, his skin seemed to glisten with an oily sheen, making him appear less like a man and more like a statue carved from damp coal, animated by the spirit of the flood. He held no weapon, no knife, no club. He just stood, his chest heaving slightly, his eyes, if they could be seen, staring directly into the chaos that Thorn represented. "There!" Thorn screamed, shattering the oppressive silence. "Open fire! Now!" 28 rifles erupted simultaneously. The roar of the gunpowder was deafening in the narrow corridor, followed instantly by the whistling chatter of lead tearing through the humid air. The volley was immense, a cascade of death meant to tear the phantom into ribbons. But Elias did not flinch. He did not dodge. He simply lowered himself back beneath the water, disappearing as if the swamp had swallowed him whole, the ripples closing instantly over the spot where he had stood. The bullets only disturbed the surface, punching holes in the water that quickly healed themselves. It was this calculated, terrifying stillness that broke the men's resolve even before the true disaster struck. They were hunting a ghost that could not be shot. And then the flood hit. Elias had not been relying on his own strength in the final confrontation. He had used his superior knowledge of the river's geology and the fragility of the human constructions along its edge. For days, perhaps weeks, he had been working meticulously on a shallow, overgrown levee further up the bayou, carefully creating a pressure point, a weak spot where the rising water table, fueled by recent heavy rains, could be channeled. When he had risen before the catchers, he had positioned himself perfectly, not to draw fire, but to confirm that the entire fleet was positioned precisely where the subsequent current would bottleneck them into oblivion. As the roar intensified, the water level in the bayou did not merely rise, it surged. It came not as a wave cresting, but as a solid hydraulic mass, a sudden, explosive release of pent-up power that immediately transformed the calm channel into a raging torrent. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The 7 flat-bottomed skiffs, designed for slow travel and easy portage, were suddenly caught broadside by a current moving at speeds they could not withstand. The boats didn't simply drift, they were lifted, slammed, and splintered. The foremost skiff, carrying 4 men, was the first to disintegrate. It was shoved violently against a massive submerged cypress log that Elias had likely placed days before, acting as a submerged anchor point. The impact was sickening, a dry, wood-rending crack that sounded like a colossal bone snapping. The boat broke in half, dumping the 4 men, weighted down by their heavy leather boots and thick woolen coats, directly into the turbulent center of the flow. Panic replaced discipline instantly. The men behind them tried desperately to backpaddle, but the current was too swift, too relentless. They were pushed inexorably forward, drawn into the churning vortex created by the shattered boat. The air filled with the high-pitched, desperate cries of men who realized in that fraction of a second that they were no longer the hunters. They were the hunted, and their killer was the very element they traveled upon. Captain Thorn's skiff, positioned slightly to the rear, fared no better. The vessel was spun around 3 times, throwing the men off balance, their rifles splashing into the black water and sinking immediately. Thorn managed to cling desperately to the gunwale for a moment, his eyes wide with a terror he had never imagined possible. He saw his men drowning, but they were not drowning alone. They were being beaten by the water, slammed into submerged roots, and dragged down by the sheer weight of the current. The river had become a brutal milling machine. Thorn saw 2 of his most hardened men fighting each other for purchase on a small patch of floating debris. their loyalty dissolved instantly by the instinct for survival. Both vanished beneath the roiling surface, their desperate hands clawing futilely at the slick air. The water was impossibly cold now, deep and relentless. The chaos lasted perhaps 3 minutes, but in the overwhelming darkness and noise, it felt like an eternity of churning death. As Thorne struggled for breath, fighting the inevitable pull downward, he saw the face of Elias one last time. The phantom was not in the center of the whirlpool. He was standing waist-deep, slightly downstream, anchored securely among the cypress knees, watching the dissolution of the punitive force with unnerving calm. He was an observer, not a participant in the immediate struggle. He had merely set the river to its work. In that brief, horrifying moment of understanding, Silas Thorne realized the profound folly of their chase. They had not been tracking a fugitive. They had challenged the Delta itself, and the Delta had answered, speaking through the vessel of this single, determined man. Elias was the chosen instrument of the swamp's judgment. A heavy section of the splintered lead skiff swept past, catching Thorne squarely on the back of his head. The impact knocked the breath from his lungs and the will from his heart. As he sank, weighted down by his own authority and his own sin, the last sensation he felt was the thick, choking mud rising up to meet him, swallowing his final agonizing gasp. 28 men vanished beneath the surging, agitated waters of the bayou, not killed by a knife or a gun, but by an engineered current, a weapon made of pure hydrology and intimate knowledge of the land. When the rush finally subsided, the bayou did not return to its previous calm. It was now a graveyard, messy and broken, littered with fragmented wood, floating debris, and the eerie, unnatural silence that follows mass destruction. The sun rose hours later, painting the eastern sky with deceptive colors of peach and rose, entirely ignorant of the horror that had transpired in the dark throat of the bayou. It was the plantation overseer from the neighboring plot, a nervous, slight man named Mr. Abernathy, who eventually discovered the scene. He had grown worried when Thorne's large expedition failed to return by dawn. Abernathy, leading a small party of reluctant field hands, found the bayou choked, the banks scraped clean by the force of the night's flood. They found fragments of clothing, a piece of heavy denim, a brass belt buckle, a soggy leather boot, but of the bodies of the 28 slave catchers, there was almost nothing definitive. The Delta, in its ruthless efficiency, had claimed them entirely. The current had carried the remains far downriver, scattering them, sinking them into the bottomless silt, turning the victims into permanent, unidentifiable parts of the swamp's hidden history. The sheer scale of the disappearance was unprecedented. 28 men, heavily armed and riding the certainty of the law, simply vanished. When Abernathy returned, trembling, to report the disaster, he could offer no explanation other than the brute force of nature. He spoke of the wreckage, the strange, localized violence of the flood, and the terrifying knowledge that the phantom had indeed been present, seen just before the water turned murderous. The official records, hastily compiled and heavily censored by the local magistrates, desperate to avoid the panic that such a failure would cause among the slaveholding class, listed the deaths as accidental drowning during an unforeseen flash flood. They omitted, of course, the fact that 28 professional men of violence, all focused on one single, unarmed target, had been lost simultaneously. But among the enslaved people, the story did not follow the official narrative. The legend of Elias, the Delta Phantom, solidified overnight. He was no longer just an escaped man. He was the Black River Ghost, the chosen child of the Delta, capable of commanding the waters and delivering judgment upon those who sought to restore the chains. The tale spread like wildfire, carried by whispers from field to field, by the secret songs sung over washboards, and by the veiled glances exchanged across dusty roads. The number 28 became sacred, a powerful symbol of resistance and impossible victory. It was proof that the oppressors, for all their rifles and their laws were ultimately powerless against the fury of nature wielded by a man of unbreakable will. The tale offered not just hope, but a visceral terror planted squarely in the hearts of those who sought to maintain the institution of slavery. The region's slave catchers, particularly those who operated in the treacherous, waterlogged regions near the Mississippi, were suddenly afflicted by a profound, new kind of fear. They learned to avoid the quiet, narrow bayous after sundown. They became hesitant, always looking over their shoulders, convinced that the waters themselves held a memory, and that Elias, the phantom, could appear at any moment, calling forth the river's wrath once more. As for Elias himself, the Delta Phantom, he was never seen again. He had achieved what few could even dream, not just escape, but the annihilation of the pursuing force, securing his freedom by rendering the hunt for him entirely too costly, too terrifying, and too supernatural to continue. He vanished into the labyrinthine freedom of the North, or perhaps remained hidden deep within the Delta's vast, unmapped interior, forever serving as the embodiment of resistance, a constant, silent threat written into the very geography of Mississippi. His story became a crucial, terrifying component of the hidden history of resistance in the American South between 1750 and 1850. It was a story of a rebellion waged not with muskets, but with intellect, courage, and an understanding that the land itself, if mastered, could be the most lethal weapon of all. The tale of the 28 drownings was a deep wound in the confidence of the planter class, a permanent reminder that even in their domain of absolute power, there were forces and men they could not conquer. The river kept its secrets, and the legend of the Delta Phantom ensured that the waters of the Mississippi would forever echo with the screams of those who dared to chase a man who had mastered the flood. If you are interested in exploring other hidden narratives of resistance and retribution from the era of American slavery, including stories of maroon communities, secret codes, and the powerful figures who defied the chains of their time, please share your thoughts and inquiries. We have only begun to scratch the surface of the history written in the mud and the shadows of the Old South.